Basically, what I am is a structural realist. I'm a person who believes that it's the structure of the international system, it's the architecture of the international system that explains, in large part, how states behave. Another way to say that is, I do not believe that domestic politics, I do not believe that the composition or the makeup of individual states matters very much for how those states behave on a day-to-day basis in international politics. And to be a bit more specific about this, I believe the fact that states live in what we call an anarchic system, that's a system where there's no higher authority that those states can turn to if they get into trouble. That fact, coupled with the fact that states can never be certain that they won't end up living next door to a really powerful state that has malign intentions. All of that causes states to do everything they can to be as powerful as possible. And again, the reason that you want to be very powerful, that you want to pursue power, that you want to dominate your region of the world, is because in that situation, there is no other state that is capable of hurting you. If you're small and you're weak in the international system, that means you're vulnerable. If you don't have a lot of power, what happens is that the powerful states are in a position where they can take advantage of you. And again, because the system is anarchic, because there's no higher authority that sits above states, there's nobody that you can turn to. There's no night watchman that you can call on the telephone to come and help you. So you're in a very vulnerable situation. And the way to avoid that is to be very powerful. And to give you a good example that really highlights this, think about the United States of America in the Western Hemisphere. The United States is by far the most powerful country in the Western Hemisphere. It has the Canadians on its northern border, it has the Mexicans on its southern border, it has fish on its eastern border, and fish on its western border. No American ever goes to bed at night worrying about another country attacking it, right? And the reason is because the United States is so powerful. So the ideal situation for any state in the international system is to be as powerful as possible, because that's the best way to survive in a system where there's no higher authority, no night watchman, and where you can never be certain that you won't end up living next door to another country that has malign intentions and a lot of military power. In the world of realism, there are basically two sets of theories. There are what one might call the human nature realist theories and the structural realist theories. The human nature realists, and Hans Morgenthau, of course, would be the most prominent example of this school of thought, believe that human beings are hardwired with what Morgenthau called an animus dominandi. To put this in slightly different terms, Morgenthau was saying that all human beings are born with a type A personality. And when they get into power, what they want to do is pursue power as an end in itself. So in that story, it's human nature, it's the way human beings are born that causes all of this conflict in the international system. That's a very different way of thinking about the world than the structural realist argument. Structural realists like me and like Ken Waltz believe that it is the structure of the international system, it is the architecture of the system, not human nature, that causes states to behave aggressively. That's what causes states to engage in security competition. It's the fact that there's no higher authority above states, and that states can never be certain that another state won't come after them militarily somewhere down the road, that drives these states to engage in security competition. So although both realist schools of thought lead to the same form of behavior, which is a rather aggressive kind of competition, the root causes are different in the two stories. Again, on one side, you have the human nature realists who focus on the way human beings are hardwired. And on the other side, you have the structural realists who focus on the basic way that the system is organized. My view is that the most important questions in international politics are what a theory should be concerned with. And there are really only a few big questions out there that matter. And these questions largely involve war and peace. And I think one of the great advantages of realism is that it has a lot to say. It doesn't provide perfect answers, but it has a lot to say about the big questions in international politics. And one of the attractions of realism is that it is a parsimonious theory, which is a sophisticated way of saying it's a simple theory. Realism is easy to understand. A handful of factors are said to describe why the world, or to explain why the world works in particular ways, why you get these very important events like World War I and World War II. And I think that that's the most important thing that a theory can do, is to provide simple explanations for very important events. This is not to say that we shouldn't have theories that explain minor actions or minor considerations or peripheral situations in the international system. But the most important theories, by definition, are going to be those theories that deal with the big questions. And the theories that are going to matter the most, and I believe this is why structural realism matters so much, are those theories that are nice and simple, that are parsimonious. I believe that if China continues to rise economically, that it will translate that economic might into military might, and that it will try to dominate Asia the way the United States dominates the Western Hemisphere. I think that China, for good realist reasons, will try to become a hegemon in Asia, because I believe the Chinese understand now, and will certainly understand in the future, that the best way to survive in the international system is to be really powerful. The Chinese understand full well what happened to them between 1850 and 1950 when they were very weak. They understand what the European great powers, the United States and the Japanese, did to them. And they want to make sure in the future that they're going to be very powerful. So I think they'll try to dominate Asia. The United States, on the other hand, does not tolerate what we sometimes call peer competitors. The United States does not want China to dominate Asia. And the United States will go to enormous lengths to prevent China from dominating Asia. And of course, China's neighbors, this includes Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Vietnam, India, and Russia, will not want China to dominate Asia. So they will join with the United States to try to contain China, much the way our European and Asian allies joined together with us during the Cold War to contain the Soviet Union. The same thing, I believe, will happen with China. So you will have this intense security competition between China, which is trying to dominate Asia, and the United States and China's neighbors, which are trying to prevent China from dominating Asia. So with regard to this question that lots of people are talking about today, can China rise peacefully? My answer is no, and my answer is based on my theory, because there's no way you can predict the future without a theory.
Now, my theory of great power politics, as some of you know, is based on 5 simple assumptions about the world. What I do is I lay out those assumptions, then I take those assumptions and I put them in the blender, and I hit the on switch and I mix the 5 assumptions up. And I say that you get 3 resulting kinds of state behavior. These 5 assumptions packaged together give you 3 kinds of behavior. And then from that, you can see very clearly, I argue, what the 2 ultimate goals of great powers are. And the story I'm going to tell you is a rather tragic story. This is why my book, which lays this theory out, is called The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. It's a structural theory which says that the structure of the international relations the structure of the international system creates very powerful incentives for states to compete with each other and even fight wars. But anyway, let me start with the 5 assumptions, and then I'll put them in the blender and talk about the 3 resulting kinds of behavior, and then talk about the 2 ultimate goals of great powers. My 5 assumptions go like this. The first is that states are the key actors in the system, and that system is anarchic. Now, when we say it's anarchic or it's characterized by anarchy, we're not saying that it's characterized by murder and mayhem. Anarchy, as I'm sure most of you know, is just an organizing principle. It means that there's no higher authority that sits above states. States are like pool balls on a table. There's no higher authority on them. Some are smaller and some are bigger, but there is no night watchman. There's no higher authority with any power that sits above states. States are the key actors, and they operate in anarchy. They do not operate in hierarchy. They operate in anarchy. So that's the first assumption. The second assumption is that all of those states have some offensive military capability, and some of them, this is the great powers, have a lot of offensive military capability. But even if you're talking about Belgium or you're talking about Guatemala, those countries all have some offensive military capability. The United States, of course, and China, Russia, Israel, France, just to name a few, those countries all have substantial offensive military capability. The third assumption has to do with intentions. And I would note to you, before I explain what I'm talking about with regarding to intentions, that the second assumption deals with capabilities and the third assumption deals with intentions. And whenever you look at other states, you always ask yourself the question, what are their capabilities and what are their intentions? When I was young during the Cold War and we used to look at the Soviet Union, you always wanted to know what were their capabilities, their military capabilities, and what were their intentions. So the second assumption deals with capabilities, and the third assumption deals with intentions. And this assumption about intentions is enormously important. And here the basic argument is that states can never know the intentions of other states with a high degree of certainty. You just can't know whether another state has malign intentions towards you or not. And one reason for that is that intentions are in people's heads, and you can't see inside people's heads. To go back to the second assumption where we talk about capabilities. Capabilities are things like armored divisions, aircraft carriers, ICBMs, fighter aircraft. These are material capabilities that you can see and you can count. So during the Cold War, we hardly ever had any real difficulty determining what the military capabilities were of the Soviet Union, because we could see what they had most of the time. With regard to intentions, we were never sure what Soviet intentions were, because we could not look inside the head of Joseph Stalin or inside the head of Nikita Khrushchev and so forth and so on. It's just very hard to tell what their intentions were. And therefore, we had huge debates about intentions. Now, some people say, John, you're exaggerating. It's possible to ascertain with a high degree of certainty what intentions are today. I'll concede that for a moment. But I would argue that even if you know what intentions of the other side are today, you cannot know future intentions, simply because you don't even know who will be in charge of any particular country in 1 year, 5 years, 10 years. Just take China. You can't tell me what China's intentions will be in the year 2025, because you don't even know who will be in charge in China. And the same thing is true of China when it looks at the United States. It can't tell who will be in charge in 2025 in Washington and what his or her intentions will be. So the point is, even if you think that you can know a country's intentions now, and I don't believe that, but even if I concede that, the fact is there's no way you can know future intentions. So there is uncertainty about intentions. Uncertainty about intentions is a constant feature of international politics. The fourth assumption is that survival is the principal goal of states. This makes perfect sense because if you don't survive, you can't pursue any other goals. Understand now, I'm not saying that states don't have other goals like prosperity. They do. States have many goals, but survival always has to be the number one goal, and other goals have to be subordinated to survival because, again, if you don't survive, you can't pursue any of those goals. And then the final assumption is that states are rational actors. They act strategically in pursuit of their goals. In other words, given that their principal goal is survival, that's the fourth assumption, my argument is that states will act rationally to come up with strategies, clever strategies, to maximize their chances of survival. Those are the five assumptions. And you will note that none of those assumptions say that states should be aggressive. That's not the argument when you talk about the assumptions. Those are five, I would say, rather benign assumptions. But you take them and you mix them in the blender and you get a rather nasty and brutish world. Three resulting behaviors. First of all, states fear each other, although the level of fear varies from case to case. Now the question is, why do states fear each other? Let's go back to the previous slide. They fear each other. Let's focus on the second and third assumptions. They fear each other because a rival state may have significant offensive military capability and it may have malign intentions. So that causes states to really worry. The second reason that states fear each other is that the system is anarchic. It's not hierarchic. If you get into trouble in international politics and you dial 911, there's nobody at the other end because there's no higher authority, right? So the great danger in the system is that you'll end up living next door to another country that is very powerful, has malign intentions towards you, and you can't dial 911 to get help. That produces fear. States fear each other. The second resulting behavior is that states quickly understand that they operate in a self-help world. As my mother used to say when I was a little boy, God helps those who help themselves. That basic rule of thumb applies in international politics. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the system is anarchic. There is no higher authority that you can turn to. You have to take care of yourself. You might say, what about other states? Well, other states are sometimes useful as allies, but again, you can never be certain what the intentions are of other states, including allies, over the long term. So it quickly becomes apparent to states that it's a self-help world. Now we come to the third resulting behavior, which is of great importance. And that is my argument that in a world where states fear each other and they understand it's a self-help world, what they do is they attempt to maximize the amount of world power that they control. You want to maximize the amount of power you have, because the more powerful you are, the less likely it is that any other state will cause you trouble, will do you harm, simply because you are so powerful. So what I'm saying is, in an anarchic world where states sometimes have significant offensive military capability, and where you cannot be certain of the intentions of those states, the best way to survive is to be really powerful. Think about the United States of America. How many Americans do you think go to bed at night worried about Canada or Mexico attacking the United States? The answer is none. And the reason is we are so powerful relative to all our neighbors that none of our neighbors would ever countenance attacking the United States. It doesn't get any better than that. Would you prefer a situation where the United States had China on one border and Russia on the other border, and Germany to the east and France to the west? Of course not. It's much better to have a situation where you have Canada to the north, Mexico to the south, and fish to the east and fish to the west. You want to maximize the amount of power that you control. Now, I argue that ultimately this leads great powers to pursue two particular goals. Just to go back to the previous slide, when I say states attempt to maximize the amount of world power they control, what exactly does that mean? John's argument is great powers have two goals. One is they want to become a regional hegemon. Underline that word regional. I'm arguing that the globe is too big and there's too much water for any country to become a global hegemon. So my argument is the best you can do is become a regional hegemon. And then you want to make sure that no other country dominates its region of the world. In other words, you want to prevent the rise of a peer competitor. And to get way ahead of myself, my argument is that the United States is the only regional hegemon in world history. We, the United States of America, became a regional hegemon. And we have gone to great lengths to prevent peer competitors. And China, as I will argue, is a potential peer competitor. And my argument, of course, is that the United States will try to prevent China from becoming a regional hegemon. And of course, you understand my argument is that China should want to become a regional hegemon. If I were in Beijing, I would want to dominate Asia the way the United States dominates the Western Hemisphere. It makes perfect sense from Beijing's point of view. But from America's point of view, it makes perfect sense to prevent China from dominating Asia and becoming a real peer competitor.
Talk about grand strategy. There are basically four grand strategies that any American leader can choose among.
米国が選択できる4種類のグランドストラテジー。1、孤立主義。2、オフショアバランシング。3、セレクティブエンゲージメント。4、グローバルドミナンス。1、孤立主義。
Isolationism。
西半球の地域覇権国である米国は、西半球以外の地域に関与しない。2、オフショアバランシング。
Offshore balancing。
孤立主義とは異なり、西半球の外に存在する、戦略上重要な3つの地域に対する、米国の限定的関与を認める。その3つの重要な地域とは、ヨーロッパと東アジアと、ペルシャ湾岸地域である。米国が常時、その3つの地域に、直接的な軍事力を及ぼすのではなく、それが認められるのは、その地域のある一国が、地域覇権を確立しようとし、なおかつ、その地域の国々が、その地域覇権を確立しようとする国を、封じ込むことが不可能な時に限る。3、セレクティブエンゲージメント。
Selective engagement。
欧州、東アジア、ペルシャ湾岸地域という、戦略上重要な3つの地域の前提は、先ほどのオフショアバランシングと共有しているが、セレクティブエンゲージメントの考え方では常にそれらの地域に直接的な軍事力を及ぼし、平和を維持することを試みる。4、グローバルドミナンス。
Global dominance。
米国にとって地球のすべてが戦略上重要であると捉え、全世界を支配して、世界に一極覇権、リベラルヘゲモニーを打ち立てようとする考え方。この考え方は民主党系のリベラルホークや共和党系の新保守主義者、ネオコンという両党のタカ派にも共有されている。
Second option is my favorite option, which is called offshore balancing. Americans, according to offshore balancers, believe that there are three areas of the world worth expending blood and iron for. Those three areas of the world are Europe, East Asia, and the Persian Gulf. Otherwise, the United States should not expend blood and iron in any areas of the world. Europe and Asia, Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia to a lesser extent, are very important because that's where the great powers are. It's where China is, Japan, Germany, France, Russia. And the Gulf is important because of oil. Okay, those are the three areas of the world you fight and die for. Offshore balancers say the only time you fight in those regions is when there is one state that threatens to dominate the region and the local states cannot control it. Soviet Union after World War II is incredibly powerful. It's just played the key role in defeating the Third Reich, right? And there's no European great power that can contain the Soviet Union. France is in shambles. Germany, of course, is in total shambles. Britain is in no position to contain the Soviet Union. So the United States has to do the heavy lifting. We have to come on shore. But otherwise, we stay offshore. In 1910, when Imperial Germany is rising, the United States relies on the Triple Entente, France, Britain, and Russia, to contain Imperial Germany. And we actually don't come on shore until April 1917. The idea is you remain offshore, and you only come on shore if the local powers cannot contain that potential hegemon. It's a very limited strategy, okay? That's offshore balancing. Isolationism says outside the Western Hemisphere, there is no area that is strategically important to the United States. Offshore balancers say there are three areas, but you only care about those areas when there's a potential hegemon. Selective engagers say there are these same three areas, but you got to stay there to maintain the peace in those three areas.
Because the United States is the only example of a state in the modern international system that has achieved regional hegemony. Other states have tried, but they've never succeeded. The United States is the only state that has succeeded. The United States also has gone to great lengths to make sure that it has never had a peer competitor. And we'll talk a little bit more about these things right now. If you go back to the beginning of this country in 1776, we're basically comprised of 13 measly colonies strung out along the Atlantic seaboard. By 1900, the United States was the hegemon in the Western Hemisphere. This was the result of conscious policy decisions from the beginning. There were two elements to our policy. The first was manifest destiny, where basically we decided that we would cross the entire continent, conquer huge portions of land, and build a superstate called the United States of America. This was not done by accident. This was done on purpose. It was done for a lot of reasons. One of the main reasons was security. We wanted to make sure that we were very big and we were very powerful and that nobody could threaten our survival. And you want to bet your bottom dollar when the time comes that we cared very much about our survival from the very beginning. Think about how we gained our independence in 1776. Think about the fact that we fought the British in 1812. Think about the fact that there were huge European empires in this hemisphere when things first got started in the late 18th century. So the first thing we did was we built a superstate. We conquered huge amounts of territory, killed massive numbers of people, defeated other states in war. Then we imported in huge numbers of immigrants to fill the land. We built a powerful economy. Furthermore, we went to great lengths to get the Europeans out of this hemisphere. You all know about the Monroe Doctrine in 1823. President Monroe basically told the Europeans, I'm not strong enough to throw you out now, but I want to tell you loudly and clearly, you're not going to build any more empires in this hemisphere, and we're going to go to great lengths over the course of this century to throw you out of our hemisphere, because we don't want you monkeying around in our hemisphere. And that's what we spent the rest of the 19th century doing, running those European empires out of town. And by 1900, the United States was a super state, I think in terms of latent military power, the most powerful state on the face of the globe. And there were no more European empires left in our hemisphere. We had established regional hegemony, and this was not done by accident. It was done on purpose. Furthermore, the United States spent most of the 20th century going to great lengths to make sure that we had no peer competitors around the globe. Uncle Sam, under no circumstances, is willing to tolerate peer competitors. I'll tell you the basic story in outline form. Imperial Germany. We went to war in 1917, in my opinion, because it looked like Germany was going to dominate all of Europe. We helped cut Imperial Germany off at the knees and prevent them from dominating Europe. We went to war against Nazi Germany in 1941, although we really began to spin up in 1940 with the fall of France, because we were fearful that Nazi Germany would do what Imperial Germany tried to do and failed. We helped defeat Nazi Germany. Imperial Japan in Asia, which threatened to dominate all of Asia the way Germany wanted to dominate all of Europe. We went to war against them in 1941 and cut them off at the knees. When World War II ended and it looked like the Soviet Union might dominate all of Europe, we moved into Europe very quickly, and we went to great lengths to balance against the Soviet Union very quickly. We were aggressive from the very beginning of the Cold War until the very end, because we had no intention of letting the Soviet Union dominate Eurasia, just the way we had no intention of letting Imperial Germany, Nazi Germany, or Imperial Japan dominate Europe and Asia. The United States does not tolerate peer competitors. As far as we're concerned, we're allowed to be the only peer competitor on the face of the globe, and the historical record is quite clear on this point. So that's what hegemony means. Now, let me switch gears and talk about China. Oh, in the Clinton administration and in the business wing of the Republican Party, there's this widespread belief in the land that if we make China look like us, that we're not going to have any problems with a prosperous or a wealthy China down the road. The idea is that if you get them hooked on capitalism and you make them filthy rich, and you get them hooked on democracy and turn them into a liberal democracy like we are, and then you get them embedded in all these international institutions that we used to be so fond of, then we're not going to have any serious trouble with these folks. Now, why is that the case? That's the case because they're going to emulate us. And that means that they're not going to cause any trouble in the world, because the United States never causes any trouble in the world. All the trouble in the world is caused by other people. We're the good guys, right? And if we could just make others look like us, we would all live happily ever after. And of course, the basic story put out by businessmen in the Republican administration and the Clintonites was that what we got to do is make China look like us. These people have the story all wrong. If China gets wealthy, it's going to look like us, only it's not going to look like us the way they think it's going to look like us. It's going to look like us the way I just described us to you in the past 10 minutes. And let me tell the story to you in a bit more detail. If China becomes a giant Hong Kong, it's probably going to have about 4 times the gross national product of the United States. You understand, at the height of the Cold War, the Soviet Union had at most half the gross national product of the United States. But of course, the assumption of liberals, both in the Clinton administration and the Bush administration, is that China wouldn't do that, right? And I say, why wouldn't they do that? Why wouldn't China emulate us? If you're China, right, if you're China, don't you want to be the hegemon in Asia? Don't you want your own Monroe Doctrine? Don't you want to tell Uncle Sam that he's not welcome in your region of the world? You understand, we have told the Chinese loudly and clearly they are not welcome in our region of the world. No great power is welcome to bring its military forces into the Western Hemisphere. You all are old enough to remember how crazy we used to go during the Cold War. During the Cold War, when the Soviets would put military forces in Cuba, right? Can you imagine what we would do if the Chinese began to deploy military forces into a place like Mexico or Cuba? We would not like that at all. Why do you think that China is going to be enthusiastic about us staying in Asia with a large military force once it has the capability to dominate that region? I think it's highly unlikely that they will be happy about that situation. I think they will go to considerable lengths to dominate Asia and to get us out of Asia, the same way we went to considerable lengths between 1776 and 1900 to dominate the Western Hemisphere. Again, this is not because I believe the Chinese are evil people or to put it in different terms, because I believe the United States is filled with evil people. It's because the best way to survive in an anarchic system where other states may someday come after you is to make sure that you are the biggest and baddest dude on the block, which, when translated into practical terms in international politics, means to make sure that you dominate your region of the world. You have no other state in your region that can seriously threaten you militarily, and furthermore, across the rest of the globe, there is no peer competitor. That's dominated our foreign policy. Why do you think it's not going to dominate Chinese foreign policy as China gets more and more powerful? I would argue that China will behave that way. This brings us to the question of how do you think the United States will respond to this? What is going to be the American part of this story? Well, I think the evidence is quite clear on this. The United States has a rich record of trying to cut off at the knees any potential hegemon in either Europe or Asia that looks like it might someday be a peer competitor. If we did not tolerate Kaiser Bill's Germany, Adolf Hitler's Germany, Tojo's Japan, or Stalin's Soviet Union as peer competitors, why do you think we will tolerate China as the dominant force in Asia? The fact of the matter is we will not. We will go to great lengths to contain them and to cut them off at the knees, just as we did with those 4 other potential hegemons that precede China in this hypothetical situation. So the basic storyline that I'm telling you is that if China continues to grow economically, which means it will have the wherewithal to develop a mighty, formidable military capability, it will emulate the United States, and it will try, I believe, to establish hegemony in Asia the way we have established hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. And the United States, on the other hand, will go to great lengths by forming an alliance with Japan, Korea, Vietnam, India, and Russia, just to name the main partners, to create a counter-hegemony coalition that can contain China and hopefully, over the long term, ruin it as a peer competitor. Because again, although Americans don't like to admit these things, the fact of the matter is we don't tolerate hegemons anywhere else in the globe but in the Western Hemisphere. And here, we are the hegemon. Thank you.
Hegemony. And as I say, that'll have 2 components. One, making sure they're more powerful than all their neighbors. And number 2, doing everything they can to get the United States out of East Asia. Furthermore, as China gets more and more powerful, it's likely to interfere in the politics of the Western Hemisphere, the way the United States interferes in Asia's politics. You want to understand that one of the reasons, maybe the principal reason, that the United States runs around the world deploying military forces in all areas of the world is because it does not have serious security threats in the Western Hemisphere. We Americans, in a sense, are free to roam. We're free to roam into China's backyard. Well, if China can roam into our backyard, into America's backyard, and form military alliances or close relations with countries like Brazil or Mexico, this will force the United States to focus more on the Western Hemisphere and less on East Asia, which is in China's interest. So you see, the Chinese will not only have an incentive to become a regional hegemon, they will have a powerful incentive to meddle in the Western Hemisphere, maybe even form an alliance or try to form a military alliance with a country in this hemisphere, which of course would violate the Monroe Doctrine and anger the United States greatly. But nevertheless, from China's point of view, that's a smart thing to do.